that actually happened. This isn't an event. This is a parable that Jesus told. And so, again, I think he told it and he chose these two characters because they are in such stark contrast to one another. And that was part of what was meant to kind of shake people, to get them to recognize, get them to understand. And so when we kind of line these up, let's take a look at these two characters from what we just read here. First of all, we'll talk about the differences. Are there any similarities between these two characters? From what we just read, can you think of any similarities? They both went to the temple to pray. So I would say, so they're both Jews, right? They're both Jews, most likely. I mean, the tax collectors primarily were Jews. They both went to the temple to pray. Anything else? I'm not looking for something, by the way. Like it kind of starts and stops there, right? You have two men going to the temple to pray. They have a goal in mind. Darren? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And Jesus is about to call that out. So the Pharisee, as you remember from the text, the Pharisee is kind of front and center, offering the prayer, as opposed to the tax collector that it says stood far off. I don't know how far away that was, but you get the sense that this Pharisee wanted to be there, wanted the spotlight, wanted to be in the front. We've read about in the past the Pharisees drawing attention to themselves. Their worship, that was the purpose of it for them sometimes, was to draw attention to themselves. And so this Pharisee is there in front of everyone offering this prayer, whereas the tax collector doesn't want any part of it. The thing I notice is the Pharisee, he's standing, he's head up, he's seeking attention. We read from Matthew chapter 6, Jesus calling this specific thing out. He says, when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, disfiguring their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. There was an intent of what they were trying to do. How many, let's be honest, raise your hand if you have a little bit of drama in you sometimes, and you've done something really because of the attention you wanted from it. And I will allow you to go back to your childhood days for this question. So most of you should kind of raise your hand. Okay. Like, I have young kids, and one of them in particular, we know when she is looking for attention. You get all of that. You see this with the Pharisee, and this is the way Jesus conveys their acts. It's when they're fasting, it's, oh, this is so hard on me. And in their faces, you just see it, and it's just wearing on them. It's all an act. It's all a show, right? That's the impression we get with the Pharisees in general, and specifically here as well. They're doing it for the attention. As opposed to, what do we see and what do we read into the intentions of the tax collector here? Say it again. The attention is definitely not on him. In fact, he's trying to avoid attention, I would say. Yeah? I don't belong. Have you ever been somewhere where you ever been to an event where you felt like everyone else was either you were way underdressed or you just weren't in the same social class, and you walk in and you're like, I don't belong here, right? It's almost kind of this sense of there's all these religious people around me, there's the Pharisees, and I do not belong here. It's almost like we talked about not wanting attention. It's almost like he was even embarrassed to ask for God's attention in this moment too. He just didn't want that. Have you ever disappointed a parent or a friend? How hard is it to have that conversation with them? That shame. You ever been embarrassed to go to God in prayer sometimes because of something that you've done inside, and God knows it, but for some reason, saying the words in your mind in that prayer to Him can be hard. There's shame. There's embarrassment. That's the idea I get here with the tax collector. And then we have the tax collector, this self-exaltation. Oh, I'm sorry. Comment. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I think that's exactly right. He's owning it, right? Whereas the the Pharisee is pushing it off, or not even recognizing it. That's part of the problem, is not even recognizing it in himself. The Pharisee, one of the things I noticed when we read there's only 2 sentences that the Pharisee mentions here. And how many times does he use the word I? It's like 5 times in 2 sentences. I do this. I am glad. And to your point, the tax collector is instead kind of turning it inward. Be merciful to me. Complete opposites. Look at one of his statements there about fasting, right? What does he say about his fasting habits? Twice a week. Anybody know the significance of that? It'd be hard. Jason? There was, so yeah, it does go back to the Mosaical law. At least from what I've read, there was really one specific time we read about in Leviticus that was carried on as a tradition of fasting. Not sure if that was a multiple day stretch like you mentioned, but we read about the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. The point being, there was really only one time when they were required under the law to fast. And so the point this Pharisee is making is, I go above and beyond, right? I do more. Whereas the tax collector, this idea of self-abasement, it's almost like he is emotionally crawling to God. I mean, he points, as we mentioned already, he points the finger at himself. He owns it. I mean, you can hear him as he's saying, be merciful to me, a sinner, and he's beating his chest, right? Really driving home the point. Be merciful to me, and he kind of feels it. Again, polar opposites of what we're experiencing here. In the Mosaic law, they were required to give a tenth of what they produced for the ongoing work of the Lord through the Levites and the priests. The Pharisees in particular were so scrupulous in doing this that they paid a tithe even from the smallest garden crops. Matthew 23 tells us, Jesus talks about them tithing the mint, the dill, the cumin. So typically you would be tithing the work from the cattle, what you're getting from the ground, what you're producing. They were taking it even a step further. Jesus doesn't condemn it necessarily, but he says they're missing the point. It's because why they're doing it. He takes the garden crops. He says, you're tithing these little things. And that's the point here of the Pharisee. I tithe more than everyone. I give more than everyone. It's interesting. It's an interesting contrast where the Pharisee is, on one hand, saying he's giving more than what's required. And yet, when we read what we know about the tax collector, it's quite possible in his professional life he's taking more than what's required. And he recognizes it. And that's the big difference. He recognizes it, and the Pharisee does not. Anything else? Any comments you take away from this, reading this comparison? Dan? Yeah. Yeah. He's just right over here. I'm glad I'm not like the murderer, the adulterer, the extortioner, or this guy right over here. Yeah. In the temple. He's calling out this guy. Pretty bold. You can, yeah, I mean, you can start to see why Jesus so many times was outwardly, he spoke out against the Pharisees because, I mean, that's not the example he wanted his people to have, that arrogance. We read about the warning against false prophets and how they will be dealt with. At the very least, it's a bad influence, right? But these are not the type of people, Jesus is saying, that are going to inherit the kingdom of God. Not with that heart, not with that mindset. He'd been there. Yeah. Paul had been there. And so that's actually a good segue because again, we can kind of like we talked about last week with the sower, we can kind of take this idea, this mentality when we read these parables and we can say, which one am I? Am I this or am I that? So in Paul's case, he was that and he became this. So we're not always this or that. Maybe we're transitioning. Maybe we're transforming. So, big picture, what do you think the point of this parable is? Is it specifically about prayer? Is it about how we come in prayer? Is it more than that? What do you think, David? There's a lot to unpack there. And I agree. So there is the idea of one approaching it with a self-centeredness and another one approaching it with God as the center. That's the focus. The other thing I hadn't really thought of until you just mentioned it there is we mentioned both of them go into the temple. Imagine the emotions going into that temple. If you're the Pharisee, it's an opportunity to walk in there and just kind of strut. You're almost looking forward to it. You're there to put on a show. But think about from the tax collector standpoint. What would it have been like to bring yourself into that moment, knowing that, again, you're looking inward. You're looking at, have mercy on me, a sinner. You know people are going to be looking at you. You've got the brand, the tax collector brand on you there. It's just got to be an emotional moment to walk into that, to face that, and just to do what you're there to do, to humble yourself, to submit yourself, prostrate yourself before God, beg for mercy, beg for forgiveness. Jeremy? Jason, Steve, and then Jason. You come on your knees. Yeah. Jason, and then Tom. That's a good point. So the tax collector is looking for something. He's looking for atonement. He's recognizing that something needs to be done about his state, whereas the Pharisee is just making his case for why he's great. Right? He's not seeking anything out of it other than just maybe self-glorification. Tom, and then he was doing, yes. Well, we can dig into that a lot, right? Like the Pharisees, that idea of what they were doing on the outside was, yeah, correct. But the motives, the intent, absolutely. Uh, a good point. Yeah. So Pam's comment, if you didn't hear, was the idea of today, if her example was a prostitute, it could be a lot of different things, came into the service. One, what it would have taken for that person to come here, how would she have been received by us? And so that kind of jumps down to kind of what's the application for us today, right? Because, again, I'll go back to, this isn't about us figuring out, oh, we're this person, we're the tax collector, right? Have we ever been the Pharisee at times? Maybe even on a daily basis, even if it's just a little bit. It's the way we think about something. We can be both. We can be prideful and humble at the same time. Scott? Well, yeah, and I think in this scenario, we really build up the tax collector. He still has a choice to make when he leaves, right? He's still doing the same job. He's still facing the same potentially sinning ways that maybe he had before. Is he a changed person, or was he in this moment sincere and honest in his approach to God? Jeremy? We so last week with the sower called out so many times. It's just the idea of listen, hear, like, and those that were hearing but weren't really hearing. They couldn't hear. They'd become like their idols. He ends this with, um, "Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted." And that's a phrase we hear multiple times in the Gospels as well. Pride is the root of that sin, and it has no place in God's kingdom. I think that's one of the main things that's being called out here. You coming to God with a prideful heart that's going back to the idea of self-centered, or are you coming to with a humble heart that is centered on God? Somebody else? Did I miss a hand? Dan? I just gave you an opportunity. We compare ourselves to other people. Yeah. Jeremy? Right. But I think you're right. We have that can happen with us where we're saying we're looking at whether it's our relationship to each other, to God, whatever, and say we're comparing ourselves to each other. We can do that as a congregation. Compare ourselves to another congregation, right? But that's not the standard. And we can lose sight of that pretty easily. So I think the parables, again, we looked last week, we talked about that thorny soil where other things in this world are competing for our time with God. And we can see some of that in ourselves. We see some of the Pharisee, some of the judgment in ourselves and our lives. And I think that's one of the things that we'll continue to see in the parables is they allow us an opportunity to really self-evaluate and potentially kind of course correct if it's needed in our lives at times. Because again, I don't think we're either this or that. I think we're moving through life and reading things like this and talking over the examples that we read really helps us come back and evaluate where we are and where our mind is in relation to God. We just got a couple minutes. We'll bring this up every week. We've taken to categorizing these parables, Jeremy and I say we, into these kind of three categories. And so be thinking about where you think this particular parable would fall within this system. Does it fall within the surprise, explaining the surprise of God's kingdom, God's upside down kingdom, or God's kingdom requires a decision? It's funny, last week when I posed this question, we got answers on all three categories, which was, I thought, really interesting, and I like that because it might not necessarily fit in one. So I will leave that for you because we're running out of time, but be kind of thinking through that each week as you go through. Next week, Jeremy is going to be talking about the parable of lost things from Luke 15. You should, if you do not have a study guide packet, again, there are more out in the foyer. I haven't heard the second bell. Anybody have one last comment? Scott. Perfect. Thank you all very much.